What if I told you that one of America's least remembered presidents carried not only the weight of a divided nation, but a haunted bloodline cursed from within? That deep in the heart of early American aristocracy, just beneath the polished veneer of patriotism and honor, there lay something darker. A family bound by blood in more ways than one, a marriage between cousins, a house full of secrets, and three sons, all taken too early, as if fate was clawing back at a legacy it never wanted born. This isn't a tale about political strategy or war heroics. This is the story of President Franklin Pierce, America's 14th president. But more chillingly, it is the story of a family tree folded inward, a dynasty slowly imploding under its own genetic weight. The Pierces weren't a ruling class in the traditional sense. They didn't wear crowns or parade around palaces. But for a brief, sorrow-filled period, they were America's closest thing to a cursed royal family. Born in a log cabin in Hillsborough, New Hampshire in 1804, Franklin Pierce was the product of early New England elitism, Puritan blood, political ambition, and yes, a tightly knit community of interconnected families. At first glance, the young Franklin had all the traits of a promising figure: a charming appearance, elite education at Bowdoin College, and a law career launched with confidence. But behind that charisma was a mind growing increasingly fragile. He was moody, melancholic, and prone to spells of depression that family members hushed up as mere tiredness. His father, Benjamin Pierce, a Revolutionary War veteran and New Hampshire governor, was hailed for his patriotic service. But there were whispers even then that the Pierce line, dating back to the earliest colonial days, was steeped in insularity. Many of Franklin's relatives had married cousins. The lines blurred in small towns and in even smaller circles of privilege. It was a quiet, unspoken practice among the American elite. Marry local, marry familiar, keep the name pure. And so it was no surprise when Franklin married Jane Appleton, his first cousin once removed. The union, on paper, was strategic and respectable. Jane was the daughter of a college president, a religious woman, well-mannered and frail. But beneath the lace gloves and quiet smile lay the same blood as Franklin, the same lineage, the same potential for disaster. From the moment they married, Jane and Franklin seemed to exist in different worlds. He, loud and political, thriving in the backroom deals of Washington. She, sickly and withdrawn, detesting public life and shunning even small social engagements. Their children, what few they had, would bear the brunt of this cold arrangement. Their first son, Franklin Jr., died just days after birth. No cause was ever publicly given, but the whispers began. Their second child, Frank Robert, seemed healthier, but didn't live past his fourth birthday. The final and most haunting of their sons was Benjamin, nicknamed Benny. By all accounts, he was bright, tender, and the hope of the family. Jane clung to him obsessively, believing that he would be spared, that the curse, if there was one, would end with the others. But fate, as it often does in stories like this, saved its cruelest blow for last. Just weeks before Franklin Pierce was to assume the presidency, the family boarded a train in Massachusetts. It derailed, and in front of both parents, 11-year-old Benny was thrown from the carriage and crushed to death. His head was reportedly nearly severed. Jane never recovered. She took it as a sign from God that her husband was being punished for seeking power. She locked herself away, wearing mourning black for the entirety of his presidency. She would write letters to her dead sons. She believed their deaths were divine interventions sent to keep her from loving too deeply in a world that had grown too cruel. Franklin, too, spiraled, but in silence. He turned to alcohol with renewed vengeance. It had always been his vice, but now it became his companion. As president, he was erratic, disinterested, and ineffectual. His support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act tore the country closer to civil war. But many believe he was barely present mentally at all. He would sit in the White House, writing cryptic letters and staring out windows, grieving the child he watched die. Some claim to have seen him wandering the halls at night, drunk and muttering Benny's name. By the end of his term, both the public and his party abandoned him. But what's perhaps most unsettling isn't the political failure. It's the strange pattern that followed the Pierce line. Many of his cousins, both paternal and maternal, suffered from early death, mental illness, or unexplained sicknesses. Genetic researchers looking into early American dynasties have noted that the Pierces, like many colonial families, came from a shallow gene pool. Intermarriages among New England elites were frequent in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The goal was social preservation, but the cost was biological. One medical historian wrote, "The Pierces represent a hidden American aristocracy, not royal in title, but in how completely they collapsed from the inside." After Franklin's presidency ended, he returned to New Hampshire, a broken man. Jane died shortly after, in deep mental anguish. He would spend the rest of his life alone, drinking himself into oblivion. Some believe he died from liver failure. Others insist it was suicide, cloaked as natural death. There was no grand funeral, no monuments, just a quiet burial in Concord, and a legacy most history books prefer to gloss over. But the question remains, how different might this story have been if Jane and Franklin had not shared blood? If their children had lived? If their minds hadn't cracked under the weight of loss and lineage? Was it simply tragedy, or was it the long, slow decay of a family that tried to keep its identity too pure? This is not just a sad story. It is a warning. The Pierces remind us that America's founding families were not immune to the dangers of closed circles. That behind the portraits and the patriotism were people bound by biology, sometimes disastrously so, and that in the shadows of power, even presidents can be pawns to something older and darker than politics, their own blood. Franklin Pierce's story did not end with his final breath in 1869. While his presidency faded into obscurity, and few school books bothered to revisit his years in office, the legacy of the Pierce bloodline continued to flicker quietly, eerily, and with echoes that still haunt American genealogy circles. What happens to a family that implodes from within? What fragments are left when the last heir is lowered into the ground? The Pierce family may have vanished from the national spotlight, but their genetic shadow still lingers, buried in documents, tombstones, and whispered family secrets across New England. And the most unsettling truth of all, they were far from alone. After Jane's death in 1863, Franklin became increasingly isolated. With no surviving children, the family line, at least in its direct form, ended with him. But in the broader Pierce family tree, the roots and branches told another story. Numerous cousins, many descended from the same Puritan ancestors who first landed in Massachusetts Bay, continued to intermarry well into the late 1800s. It was a quiet, almost invisible practice, not out of romantic passion, but out of custom, status, and preservation. These weren't backwoods folk in remote isolation. They were the descendants of Harvard men, ministers, and governors, the very architects of early American society. But in their attempt to safeguard legacy, they were passing on more than names. They were inheriting frailty. Medical historians have identified an unusually high incidence of mental illness, miscarriages, and early deaths in branches of the Pierce family throughout the 19th century. Depression, in particular, seemed to plague male descendants, while women often suffered from nervous disorders, a polite Victorian term that often masked schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and postpartum psychosis. These were often hidden behind closed doors or quietly institutionalized. And it wasn't just the Pierces. They were emblematic of a broader problem, one that afflicted many of America's so-called first families. Look closer, and you find eerie parallels in families like the Adams, the Lees, the Cabots, and the Lodges. Intermarriage among elite families was commonplace. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, bloodlines were carefully managed. Marrying someone of similar status often meant marrying someone with shared ancestry, sometimes just once removed. Cousins were not uncommon. Occasionally, even uncle-niece matches occurred, cloaked under veils of acceptability by money and position. The American aristocracy, though informal, was very real, and like the royal families of Europe, they so often emulated, their dynasties came with a cost. In the Pierce case, it was painfully visible. Benny Pierce, the last of Franklin and Jane's children, was their final hope. His intelligence and sweet nature were so pronounced that friends of the family believed he was destined to redeem the family's tragedies. But modern psychologists, analyzing his surviving letters and biographical details, have noted signs of obsessive behavior and social anxiety even in childhood. He was not a well-adjusted boy. He was, in fact, eerily similar to his mother, Jane, who, in her youth, suffered prolonged bouts of depression and withdrew from most forms of social life. These were not isolated traits. They were signs of a pattern passed down through blood. What's especially fascinating is how the story of the Pierces reflects a broader denial within American culture. We tend to think of inbreeding as a European or rural phenomenon, confined to monarchs or forgotten Appalachian hollows. But the truth is more unsettling. In the colonial and post-colonial Northeast, elite inbreeding was as real as anywhere else. It was simply better hidden, recorded with formality, cloaked in prestige, and rarely questioned. The assumption was that if the family had land, titles, or founding fathers in its background, its unions were beyond reproach. But that arrogance was its own downfall. Genetics knows no class system. As the 20th century approached, remnants of the Pierce lineage dispersed. Some cousins took on new surnames, marrying out of the old elite and blending into newer American families. Others fell into obscurity, some unmarried, some childless, some lost in the paperwork of old wills and estate records. A few ended up in asylums, according to archival death notices, though rarely acknowledged publicly. In a particularly haunting case, a Pierce cousin institutionalized in 1902 was found to have written letters to Jane and Benny long after both had died. They were never mailed, just stacks of them, addressed over and over to ghosts. It wasn't until the 1970s that a renewed interest in American political genealogy brought the Pierces briefly back into academic focus. A handful of researchers traced Franklin Pierce's extended family and began connecting the dots: birth defects, mental health crises, even possible markers of inherited epilepsy. One study posited that the frequency of early childhood deaths in the Pierce family, while not unique, was higher than average among similarly affluent 19th century families. In simpler terms, something was wrong with their blood. And yet, even today, Franklin Pierce is remembered more for his political failures than his family tragedy. He's often listed among America's worst presidents, usually cited for his support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which helped accelerate the nation towards civil war. But rarely is his mental decline examined in full context. Rarely do we ask how much of his failure was shaped not by incompetence, but by grief, depression, and inherited trauma. What happens when a nation chooses a leader not based on merit, but bloodline, legacy, and perception? What if the very structure of our early political system enabled these familial collapses to play out in public office? It is no coincidence that many of America's founding fathers and early statesmen came from interconnected families. The Constitution may have been built on democratic ideals, but the culture remained
Subscribe to my
feudal.
channel.
Lineage mattered. Connections mattered more than competence. The Pierces were merely one strand in this larger American aristocracy. Their tragedy, though singular in its detail, is representative of a broader flaw in the nation's early social fabric. In the end, the Pierce family didn't leave behind a towering political dynasty. They didn't produce senators, governors, or presidents in the generations that followed. They left a cautionary tale, a lineage haunted not by scandal or corruption, but by internal decay, a family tree that grew inward, folding over itself until it strangled its own roots. And maybe that's the most American tragedy of all, not a fall from power, but a legacy that never had the strength to stand in the first place.